Hello and welcome to Unity 101 Week 6. Today I'm going to be here. My name's Nelson, and so will Gavin.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, so today we're going to make the player actually shoot at things. So that's going to be lots of fun if Unity decides to open up on the correct monitor. So yeah, so there's quite a few different things that we're going to be doing today. I'm going to start off, and this will just be pretty much all kind of project-oriented, or not project-oriented, but participation-oriented. I really want people to, follow along if you're participating. Obviously, the homework will be to implement what we've done. If you don't want to follow along, just, sit back and relax and watch the video when it comes out. But, of course, people who do follow along get to actually ask us questions to clarify things or to go over common issues. So we're not actually going to start off with the player today, although that will be a major focus later in the video. Today we're going to be putting together kind of the first thing we're going to be doing is kind of putting together a different sort of way to handle the levels. See, we don't really have a concept of levels yet with our game. As people have noticed, and I'm in the wrong scene, of course, people have noticed there really is no concept of levels. And if we win or if we die, if we win or we lose, we also start back right where we started, or right where we were. So there's really no concept of what a level is. There's no level progression, and there's no way to reset the entire level to how it is. Currently, everything is parented to our segments. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking the stuff that's inside of the segments and making it different than the segments themselves.
Yeah, the segments are going to be dedicated to, we're basically splitting apart the scrolling of the star field, which needs to check when it's gone off screen and jump to carry on being an infinite, scroll. We're going to separate that from the level elements, and we're going to wrap those up in an object and actually have the concept of a level there in our game. Because also at the moment, when the player, if the player runs into something, it's entirely feasible. And if you've got the same turrets at the same scale as we have, if the player runs into a turret, they will quite often reappear right in the middle of a turret,
Yeah,
the same turret,
saw that just
and
now,
immediately die again. So we need to do something about that, and the way we've chosen to handle it is to basically make each life be an attempt to get through the level without dying. So you just start back at the beginning of a level again.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So yeah. So, not surprisingly, the way that we're going to handle this is through prefabs. So basically, we're going to take everything that's stuffed up in here, all the things that are in our level, such as our gates and our turrets small and all that fun stuff, and we're going to prefabify this stuff and instantiate it every time we want to start playing a level. So, the first step is we need to talk a little bit about reinstantiating prefabs. I know we did discuss it to some extent when we built the barrel. So does everybody remember how we built the barrel? We gave him a public field that pointed to a game object. Now the great thing about a public game object field is that you have two options of wiring that up. You can wire it up to a prefab under your project, or you can wire it up to an actual object in your hierarchy. So I'm pretty sure Unity is going for a new world record as far as how slow it can open up Visual Studio.
The great thing about this is it does all this and then just often doesn't even open up Visual Studio.
That's my least favorite thing in the world. Well, no, but it's up there. Okay, so if we look at our turret barrel, notice how it has a public game object projectile. And every time we want to instantiate the projectile, we simply invoke the GameObject.instantiate method, passing in the projectile to it. Now, remember how if we look at an actual turret, or more specifically, the doohickey that shoots things, which is the barrel, notice how it has the script attached to it, and we pointed the projectile to a prefab. We did the turret barrel last week. So if you don't have a turret barrel, you probably didn't do last week. And there's no excuse to that because I actually got the videos for last week uploaded, about an hour after the class. So,
Nice. I wouldn't go there if I were you.
well, I did.
But
it was amazing.
Yeah. Anywho.
Yeah. So, stuff. What we need to do is we need to go ahead and do the same sort of thing where we pointed a public field, in this case a game object public field, to a prefab. We need to do the same thing to our game manager script, and not only give it the amount of our segments, because remember our segments are for our background now. We're not using them for our actual objects or our actual game objects. But now we need to do another array that points to level prefabs. So let's get that started. So go ahead and hit participate if you guys want to follow along. I'm going to jump into a game manager, which I got to by hitting Control-T, GM, Enter, for people who are curious about how ReSharper can be incredibly awesome. And then I'm going to add another public field to it. I'm going to say, and then ReSharper fails me twice. There we go. I'm going to add a public game object array called levels. And so that will behave just like our segments, except for we're going to point it to level prefabs. So a few other things that we're going to have to deal with on our game managers. We also need to provide the level scroll speed as well as what level we're currently on. So down here, I'm going to say public float level float. Wow, that's amazing. I don't know how that came out of my keyboard. So I'm going to do public float level scroll speed, and I'm going to set this to 4 by default. And then I'm going to add a public int current level index, which I'm just going to actually make a property. And the reason I'm making this a property is that that's how things really should be, but of course we have to make some things fields in order for them to be inspectifiable. So now I'm going to add a public game object current level. And my ReSharper today is really slow, and I do not know why. Okay, so we have our current level index and our current level. So we added... Okay, this is getting really bad. I don't know if you guys can see this, but my keystrokes are only being interpreted like 10 seconds after they happened. Not 10 seconds, like 5 seconds, but it feels like 10 seconds. Wow.
I'd be inclined to pause the video and restart Visual Studio.
Yeah, for all the future people, we will be right back. For all the present people, give me 1 second as I beat ReSharper into submission. And we're back. So, does everybody have these members added?
I think we're good.
Yeah, click ready if you're good, hit 1 more minute if you are still typing. If I do not see any more 1 more minutes, we will move on. And if I do, we will probably move on anyway, because it looks like almost everybody's done.
Sweet.
Okay.
Haven't blow things up yet.
Well, we're getting to it. See, that's going to be that's the carrot I'm using to make sure that people actually stick around for the entirety of the class.
Oh, okay.
So, now we have our current level index, our current level, our levels and so we should be able to go forward. Now there are a few things we're going to need to do inside of our, well, we're not going to worry about that just yet actually. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set these up in Unity. So to do that, the first thing we need to do is turn not the star fields, but all the stuff inside the star fields into their own prefabs, which is actually very simple to do. If you select everything inside segment 1, and then unselect the starfield cylinder, we can go ahead and make a prefab out of it. Now what I'm going to do is under the prefabs folder, I'm going to add a new folder called levels, because...
Well, these are just prefabs, but they are, we're using them for a very specific purpose, and by segregating them in this way, it does make life easier.
Right, and we will be probably separating out stuff like these too at some future time. Because we're constructing this game based off prefab so heavily, we really do need better organization.
And for those of you who are sort of feeling more comfortable with this and want to go digging beyond the 101 point, you can actually deal with folders outside of your assets folder via more complex code. So have a dig around on the Unity website, because that way you can start to deal with things that aren't bundled up and are added by the user and so forth.
Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select everything in segment 1, and I'm going to simply click and drag it into levels. And it's not wanting me to do that.
No, you need to create a prefab first. So in the hierarchy, I would create a game object.
Yeah, so I'm going to create a game object. I'm going to call this game object level 1. I'm going to parent...
Check its zeros.
What?
Check its position.
Yeah. So level 1 I want to be positioned at 0, 0, 0, because that will become important later once we start positioning this level dynamically. So I want the level to be positioned at 0, 0, 0.
We're assuming for this, and we're not actually enforcing it anywhere, so it is just a question of making sure that your prefab is set up this way, that the levels, the actual level game objects transform is at the origin.
Right. So then I'm going to go ahead and take everything here except for the starfield cylinder, and I'm going to parent it to level 1. And then I'm simply going to move level 1 into levels as a prefab. Then I'm going to delete it out of the hierarchy.
And that's important.
Yes. And
you can bring it back to work on, as we have been doing in the Scratch level with the turrets and so forth. It's quite possible to drag a prefab into a level, fiddle around with it, apply things, and then delete the instantiated version. That's, for me, certainly that's the preferred way of working with them, because it's the easiest way to get some sort of visual feedback.
Yep. So as you see, I just jumped into Scratch and I instantiated level 1, and this is where we can edit level 1 to do whatever we need to do. For example, if I wanted to add another turret, I could. But I'm going to jump back into the other scene now, and notice how it's empty, and we'll see why it needs to be empty in a moment. But so all we did was we packaged up all our game objects and prefabified them into a prefab called level 1. So I'm going to reset everybody's ready and go ahead and hit 1 more minute, or ready.
Or ready if you're ready.
Yeah. I mean, the buttons speak for themselves.
They really should. You should get that Mac voice, the girl voice from about 1990 something.
I don't think I'm familiar
Was it Sam? I can't remember what they used to call it. It was really funny because you could program the error messages yourself. You could actually program the string. And where I was working, there were 3 of us. There was the guy who did the arrangements, I did the sheet music prep, and another guy who actually worked on a Mac doing all the backing tracks. And there was one day where he spent 9 hours installing a set of samples, sound samples, and in the Mac version of the installer, you literally had to click OK for every sample, which is every note of every instrument.
Mm.
And he spent 9 hours sitting there. And so But every time it threw an error, it would swear at him. It was one of those days where it just wore us down. It was an attrition thing, and it became painfully funny.
All right, so
Are people done
yeah,
doing stuff?
pretty much everybody's done. So we're going to move on. So after we have our level 1 prefab, I'm going to jump into Game Manager, and I'm going to look at its levels property. So the levels field. So the levels, I'm going to give a size of 1, and then I'm going to point element 0. I'm going to click on this little circly thing, so this little circly icon, and I'm going to make sure that I'm under the Assets tab. That's important. We're not selecting a game object that we have already instantiated. We're selecting a prefab that's available in Assets. And as you see, we have a list of all of our prefabs, including level 1. So now if I just simply double-click on level 1, we've successfully set our first level as level 1.
That is the same as dragging it from the prefabs levels folder into that field on the game manager, as opposed to, and this is very important, as opposed to dragging it from the hierarchy. You know, it's not in the hierarchy anyway. If you're following along exactly with Nelson, you'll have deleted yours from there. But the distinction is very important.
Yep.
In terms of the references that Unity makes behind the scenes, how it connects things up. Can you be any more precise without going into a hideously complicated?
Well, although the field is a game object, it can be filled by one of two types of things. It can be filled by a reference to an existing object, or a reference to an object that you can instantiate, such as a prefab. We want to select a prefab from our project window instead of the hierarchy, because we want to be able to instantiate the level over and over and over again. Like, for example, if the player dies, we want to completely reinstantiate the level.
And yeah, do you just want to run through the process? You don't need to actually do it again, but just run through what you did to create level 1 as a prefab.
Or to create level 1 as a prefab?
It was a little unclear what you did. You actually needed to make the game object, and people are asking questions.
Okay, so to create the prefab, what I did was I went to game object, create empty. I zeroed out his position to 000 to the identity, or to the origin. And then I placed all of the things that constituted the level onto that game object. So, for example, all of the gates and all of the turrets and the finish gate as well. And then, once I had all those objects parented to game object, I renamed it to level 1, and I just click and drag it over onto the project window to make a prefab out of it.
Cool.
And that's all I did. And then what I did...
A few people, I think, were still catching up on the very end of the previous thing and missed some of that.
And then the next thing I did was, because we added an array of game objects field to the game manager script, I was able to go down here, drop it down, type in 1 to the size to give me one element to work with, and then I was able to click on the little circly thing and select level 1. Like Gavin pointed out, there's an alternative way to do this, which you can actually click and drag from the project window all the way onto that field itself. Well, we don't have to instantiate them separately because we're going to be instantiating them in code. We're not going to be instantiating them manually.
Yeah, if we actually left the version that was in the hierarchy that we built the prefab from, you'd end up, well, initially you'd end up with two sets of it overlapping each other. But then if you died, and in the process of us resetting the level, you would then end up with two versions of the theme that were actually offset from each other. I made a similar mistake in one implementation of this and ended up with them actually getting twice as many each time. My level bred itself every update. It was insane.
Okay, so yeah. So now what we can do is we can jump back into Visual Studio, and I'm going to open up the playing game state. So the playing game state is going to handle instantiating our things, our levels, and scrolling them, which doesn't
At
sound
the
nearly
moment,
as scary as you think it is.
well, the thing is, at the moment, we've got this skull
Skull.
for Great Lager, scroll background method that on line 18 that is checking each of the segments, which if you remember are the bits that actually have the starfield on them, and moving them along and then jumping the front one back if it passes a certain threshold. Now, all we've done in Unity is to separate the actual segments from everything that was attached to them. So the scroll background method will still move the starfield along, but that's all it will do at the moment. We're now going to add in a method to scroll our levels, and in that part of that process, we're also going to make pick the correct level via the code, so that obviously at the end of one level you can move to the next level. Go on then, do that.
Yeah. Okay, the first bit I'm going to do, though, is when our playing game state becomes instantiated, I want to also instantiate the level prefab. So that's simply going to be a matter of if manager levels length. Now this is just a quick little sanity check, and you'll understand why this is important in a second.
It's also not that watertight of a sanity check. It's not, because of the whole issue of it being an array, that sanity check checks whether the length, basically whether the index is out of range.
Right.
For the number of elements that are in the array. But you'll have noticed in the inspector that before you can actually even add an item to an array via the inspector, you have to make a space for it.
Right.
Which means it's possible to end up with a space that doesn't have anything in it. Have you got a quick fix for that? Because I was aware it was a loophole.
Oh, you mean as far as if you simply give it 10 items but you don't fill in any of them?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can add a check for that in a second. I want to finish this line out real fast, though.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically all it's doing is doing manager current level index. So it's very, very straightforward. What I'm going to go ahead and do, though, is I'm going to use resharper to be awesome. And I'm going to select everything that's in this argument that I'm passing into GameObject.instantiate. And I'm going to hit Control-Shift-R and then V. And I actually missed the V key. So I'm going to hit Control-Shift-R and then V again. Really? There we go. And it's going to, what's going to do is it's going to alias out that expression to a variable. And I'm going to call this level prefab. After doing that, I'm going to say if level prefab is null, then throw a new index, or I'm going to do an invalid operation for this one. And I'm going to say, you said there was a level here, but you lied,
Nice.
and I can't continue.
Your error messages are as written by GLaDOS.
Okay, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to shut resharper up by using the base qualifier, which can bring in a nice little using statement. Actually, I'm not going to do that because people hate it when I bring in using statements.
I particularly hate that one.
Yeah.
It's because you've got system left in there. If you could get rid of your system using, that would go away.
Right, because
that's how I deal with it.
If I get rid of system, but then if I do get rid of system, I can't do my index out of range exceptions.
Yeah.
And
anything is it bears special mention actually. Can you make it happen again? That using appearing, because
you mean this one?
there are where anytime you've got a clash between system and Unity engine, and object is one of those occasions. You will suddenly find, I've suddenly found this using in my code before, and it's a function of the fact that both Unity engine and system, in this case, have got classes in them called object, and so it doesn't know which one to choose. And if you get in the habit of using resharp very quickly, you'll get in the habit of alt enter enter all the time to fix things, and that will bring this in if there's a clash. So it's just worth noticing, because it will bite you otherwise.
Yeah. And again, that's just because there's two classes named object. Because we have system.object and Unity engine.object, which was a horrible decision on their part, but, you know, yeah.
Yeah. Most of the time you don't actually, I find myself not using the base class anyway. I use gameObject.instantiate.
Yeah, but then ReSharper throws a fit because you're using a statically inherited member, and it just becomes this huge mess.
Yes. Anyway, that's probably a discussion more for the C# 103 than this, I guess. We should probably go back to...
Well, yeah,
Hello?
so, I'm here. I'm probably just going to wait for people to catch up writing this code, though. So, 1 more minute or ready, depending on your status. Am I casting a game object to a game object? No. If we look at the method signature of instantiate, instantiate returns an object. Now keep in mind, that is a Unity engine.object and not a system.object, which I hate. But anyway, regardless, instantiate returns just an object, because you can instantiate pretty much anything. You can instantiate prefabs and other things.
Particle systems. You can basically game object inherits from object. It is, I think, the exact next level down in the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
But just the way things work out, it returns an object, and so the cast is necessary.
Okay.
I think.
So moving on, I'm going to add another method. I'm going to say add a method called scroll level. And scroll level is simply going to, well, scroll level. I mean, I don't necessarily think that needs much explanation. So the actual code inside of it is simply going to be manager, current level, transform, translate. I'm going to pass in 0, 0, and then negative manager level scroll speed multiplied by time delta time.
I do wish you'd say the word dot.
But there's so many dots.
I know, but it bugs me. The thing is, I would be listening to you speak while typing, but I need to look at the keys while I'm typing.
Well, I mean,
so I don't know when you've actually typed a dot. If you see my point.
Well, just write out a line of code without dots, and then add dots until it works.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, all I did was add scroll level, method invocation and update, and then I invoked or added that actual implementation down here, which simply translates the current level's transform by negating the level scroll speed multiplied by time.delta time. So I'm going to go.
It's just a cut down version of the scroll background method.
Yeah, except for no leapfrogging.
It's literally line 43.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially. Boom, boom.
Okay, so hit ready
now
if you are done, not ready if you... Well, don't hit not ready. Hit 1 more minute if you're still typing. What are you saying, Gav?
I was just going to say, for those of you who tried it out, because I think that's all of that in there now, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
it. Or am I missing something? Should look exactly like it did at the end of last week when you pressed play. You should have the same thing happening. But the important thing is we've divided it out now to the point where if you make another level and make your levels array bigger, and this is code that I don't believe I put in the version I sent to you, Nelson, for the windscreen state.
Which would actually increment the...
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and just knock that in on the fly, because it is only incrementation.
Well, I mean, I think what we could do is on the playing game state, or, sorry, in the goal, or during player death.
It's in the finish line.
Yeah, the finish line. I still love that name.
What would you call it?
It's just the finish line. I mean, that just reminds me of the nationality. I can't get over that. Like, seriously, that'd be like if we made a American line, or an Amazon
line.
Or a Congo line.
Anywho.
So then I would just, check to see the index, and then, stuff like that. So, we did get an error. Justin, you are getting that error because object is an ambiguous reference between object and Unity engine.object. To resolve that error, you can simply add what I have up here on line 4. That will disambiguify the object.
Disambiguate.
Whichever one.
There really is a word this time.
Okay, well then fine.
Disambiguate.
It'll disambiguate Unity engine.object from system.object. When we have all the elements that are now in the level attached to segment 1, would the level keep repeating itself every time segment is moved forward? No, the level is not going to repeat itself, because we have no code that repeats the level.
All the level stuff should no longer be attached to segment 1, though, Wolf. If Nelson couldn't flip back to the Unity...
Well, there's one more question I want to address.
Yeah.
Troy says, length on line 17, the property system.array.length has no setter. Okay, so somebody's getting an error that indicates that length has no error. In about 3 seconds, everybody post in BuzzNet what you think the issue is. This is a common issue that I really want to kind of ingrain in people's memory. Nope, it's not caused by that. It's not caused by system. Kevin got it. Kevin gets an internet cookie. What you are doing is you are missing the less than sign. Because if I do this, then you'll notice I get the exact same error that you do. So being able to sort of identify those errors is actually a really good skill. And again, when I do stuff like that, it's not like I'm making fun of people. It's that I've done this so many times that I recognize...
There are certain errors like that are incredibly common. And actually, I think it's kind of kudos for getting that in a slightly unusual way, because everyone to this day, no matter how long they've been coding, if that was an equals...
Yeah, the equality.
That's where the mistake usually happens, when you're checking for equality. Because instead of typing... Usually it's because, I swear it's because my equals key is worn down and therefore doesn't notice my lightning fast coding skills with a Z.
Ugh. But yeah,
quite.
You will run into this error all the time. But it's good to keep in mind that if you ever see an error that says something about blah 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 has no setter and you're confused about it, most likely that's the cause. Okay. I thought you said never throw an error when Unity is running. No. I think I mentioned how awful Unity's error handling is, in the sense that it will attempt to continue running your application for no particular reason. I do actually have to take care of something right now, and it is about time for a break anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and step outside real fast. Okay. Resume, and we're back. So, this syntax. So basically, there exists in the .NET framework a class called system.object. Now, system.object is what the object keyword is alias to. Just how system.int32 is an alias for int, just as system.single is an alias for float. Now, the system.object class, as most of you know, is actually the base class for all types in the BCL and almost all of the types that you will ever encounter in .NET. Now, unfortunately, that's not a rule based off some esoteric com interop stuff, but you might as well think of it like a rule. Every type inherits from object. The problem is that Unity has another class called UnityEngine.object. Then Unity Engine has another thing, UnityEngine.gameObject. Now, gameObject inherits from object in the same way that texture 2D inherits from object, which is Unity Engine.texture2D, and then we also have Unity Engine.component, and of course, as we all know, Unity Engine.mono behavior, and the spelling, you guys know what I mean.
IOUR.
IOUR. So that's kind of the hierarchy that we have. So the mono behavior inherits from component, which inherits from object, which at the end of the day ultimately inherits from system.object. So this is the true inheritance hierarchy for Unity stuff. The problem is that there's an ambiguation between system.object and Unity Engine.object. See, if we import using system and we import using Unity Engine, C# has no way to identify if, when we type in object with a capital O, if we're referring to system.object or Unity Engine.object. So we have two options. See here on line 31, I can either type in Unity Engine.object directly, or I can do this. Line 4 says that if it tells the C# compiler, hey, if you ever see object with capital O, I'm referring to the Unity Engine.object. So basically it's a competition between .NET, C#, and Unity's object. Yes. So we have to declare which one we're talking about via casting. Not via casting. Casting has nothing to do with it. It's via this using construct that you see on line 4. This is a special form of the using syntax.
Yeah, the cast on line 31 comes from the fact that the instantiate method actually returns an object type, not a game object type. And so you need to cast it there. Did you see Stephen's question at 2 minutes past?
Yes, I was. Yeah, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to launch the program as it appears, so everybody can see what the expected output up until this point is. And of course, it decided to maximize. I'm going to speed this up. Okay, so I'm going to go into Game Manager, and I'm going to give the level scroll speed like 100. Right, and the reason the behavior that we're getting is that we don't actually destroy the level once the level is done.
And we're also, we're not incrementing the level. So each time
Right.
you start back into the level again, you've still got, that's why it's not throwing an error that it's gone out of range. It's because we're not actually incrementing it at all. Mm-hmm. So there's two different bugs there.
And we can fix those both by going into the finish line and adding some logic. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to say if manager current level index is greater or equal to manager levels dot length, then switch the state to the new win state. Otherwise, switch the state to a new playing game state. But before I switch the state to a new playing game state, I, of course, am going to have to say manager current level index increment. Finally, at the beginning of this, I'm actually going to say game object dot destroy, and I'm going to pass in manager current level, which I can just do destroy. I don't have to qualify that. So by doing that, we have now added support for multiple levels. And notice how when I win this level, I get an exception. The reason I get an exception is that I never actually set the current level to anything by the time that I do. Ooh, right, because the what's happening here is that the playing game states update method is being invoked even though I switched the state. I believe. No, that's not possible.
Where did you actually increment the... Oh, there you did it. Oh, you're incrementing the current level, but you're not checking at that point whether you can actually increment it safely.
Well, I kind of am, though,
Although...
because of this code right there. Oh, right. I'm actually...
That'll run one over, actually.
Okay, so does anybody know what these type of errors are called? There's a name for the type of error that is present on line 18. Fence post, overflow. Nope, nope. This is...
Gerald?
No, not Gerald, not giraffe. Not even Rainbow Dash. Off by one. I'm in an off by one error right here, where what I need to do is actually say if current level index is greater or equal to manager level's length minus 1. That will make sure that I'm actually... See, watch this. So if I get to the finish line, it says you win. And then if I start again, I win again, and I win again. So it's super awesome. I'm going to set the speed down to like 10. Apparently, fence post is another name for off by one.
Huh.
And according to Wiki, a fence post error, occasionally called a telegraph pole or a lamp post error, is a specific type of off by one error. The following problem illustrates the error. If you build a straight fence 100 meters long with posts 10 meters apart, how many posts do you need?
Yes. 11.
Yes.
Maths.
Okay, so stuff and things. This is the behavior that you should have. So everybody go ahead. I'm going to reset everybody. Hit ready if you're done. One more minute if you need one more minute. Blah, blah, blah. Get this code written out. We are on the finish line. We're not on the Scandinavian line.
While you're giving people one more minute, go ahead and just slap together another level, even if it's just a turret.
I'll do that up here so that people can still see the code.
You know, I like to prove that things actually work. Because often they don't. Because every time I go to you and say, go on, prove it, then you get a fence post error. But those off by ones are a big pain.
Yeah.
Which week is this?
6.
Out of 7.
Yes.
That should work out quite nicely, actually. Because we can deal with GUI stuff next week. And we've pretty much wrapped it up. Other than that, I've completely forgotten something. Nelson, did you do the destroying yet?
Destroying?
Yes, you did on line 16.
Yeah.
Somebody was saying their levels still persist.
No, they shouldn't.
When it moves to a new one. That is an incredibly non-specific question, Wolf.
Alright, it works with multiple levels.
Cool.
Where else should we put the destroy manager current level call when we die? No, don't worry about that yet. The last bit that I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into the start screen state. When we switch into the new playing state from the start screen state, I'm going to say manager current level index equals 0. And by doing that, I can now show you guys what it looks like with multiple levels. So here's level 1. Here's level 2. And here's I win. Then here's the start screen. And now here's level 1. Here's level 2. And that's a bug. So yeah, basically all I did was I created a level 2 prefab and I assigned it to the game manager.
What was the bug?
I was dead, so I wasn't, my player wasn't activated when he flew through the finish line.
Ah, you see.
But that shouldn't matter once we fix the fact that when we die, we'll reset the level.
This is true. Yes, because at the moment, if you die 3 times, what happens?
You lose.
Or indeed die at all.
Yeah, if you die at all, you just disappear for a second. Yeah, we made the level 1, but we've used the prefab because what we did was we assigned the prefab to a property of the game manager. Okay. So now jumping back into code, we have our start screen state and our finish line all done. Let's talk about death.
You really know how to bring down a party, don't you?
So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into the player and I'm going to fix up his destroy ship coroutine. I'm not going to worry about the explosions yet. We'll be adding that in a moment. But I will be worrying about actually moving around the level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, before I set active recursively to true, I'm going to say manager current level dot transform dot position equals vector 3.0. That will reset the level every time. What did I add to start screen state? I added this. I reset the current level index to 0 before switching to the playing game state. Okay. So now that we have that bit going, if we play the game and we die, notice how the level actually resets. Until I get it right. And of course, this is going way too fast.
Yeah, it's very hard to see on the screens, but everyone, if you're following along, should get the same result. So.
Yep. Okay, so all I did was I reset the current level's transform's position to 0.
Wolf, have you got a scroll level method in addition to your scroll background method?
Okay, the next thing we're going to go ahead and do.
Hang on, can you look at the questions panel?
Where'd that method be? That method is in the playing game state. I added a scroll level method that, well, I mean, it scrolls the level.
I don't know then, Wolf. He says his level doesn't move. But
Is your level scroll speed set to anything but 0?
yeah, that would do it.
Could you show start screen state again? Start screen state again. All I did was I set the current level index to 0. Okay. Who's up for changing a bunch of pre-existing code?
Oh, yes. In fact, this has been bugging me ever since I wrote the pre-existing code. Well, or the precursor to the pre-existing code.
iGame entity.
I'd like to throw this out there as a question to people. Can anybody see what the problem is that we have in terms of setting up projectiles for the player with what we've built so far? I'm just interested because we've got 3 or 4 people who seem to have past experience who might have an inkling of what the problem is, particularly given what you're showing on the screen at the moment. Wick says there's no audio code in place to make them go pew. This is true. DAC's got certainly part of it, which is that they'll collide with the player collider. The problem is that we are only accepting a player into the collide method. This is something of a limit in terms of, well, that's all we can collide with at the moment, the way our code is set up. And so now Nelson's going to go ahead and explain the complicated codey version of that as to what he's going to change it to and why.
Yes.
That was your cue.
Oh, okay. So, code. We're going to make it different. What we have right here is an interface that's kind of used to abstract the concept of collision so that we don't have to rely on Unity's notoriously horrible, awful, makes me want to vomit every time I see magical methods. But our interface only supports colliding with the player. We want this to support colliding with anything so that we can reuse the same sort of interfacey type goodness with the rest of our code that we're going to be writing, because as we make projectiles eject from our player's barrel, we want those projectiles to be able to hit things. And what those projectiles hit is not going to be a player. And what the projectiles are is not a player. So we need to sort of abstractify this method so that it can work on both players and non-player objects.
And Sarge suggested an actor class, maybe. Excellent.
Where's my kick button? We'll be talking in great detail about why inheritance hierarchies are the devil next C# class, actually. I have a big, long discussion about why the actor class is horrible and horrible planned.
Okay, so we're going to be basically changing this to accept a game object instead of a player.
And if you didn't catch that, that is typing in GO in all caps, hitting Shift, Alt, Space, and hitting Enter, because Resharper is awesome. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move the using statement that was imported outside of my namespace. Because of the plugin that I downloaded today when I was playing with, it changed some Resharper settings that I really am not very happy with. So using Unity Engine, we're now colliding with game objects. But you know what? When I hit Control-Shift-B, what's going to happen? Can anybody guess what's going to happen when I hit Control-Shift-B?
What have I been saying we're going to do all lesson? We're going to make things explode.
You are off by 10, Kaga. Dome. We actually have 6 errors. Every time, for every object that actually implements iGame entity, now doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is we changed the interface to now take in a game object instead of a player. Now, people who might be used to duck-typed languages, dynamic languages, whatever, might be saying, oh, changing an interface shouldn't break your code. But in reality, what we have now is a very nice checklist of the things we're going to have to fix to make our new interface appropriate. And of course,
Yeah, because each of these 6 errors doesn't just indicate that, well, we have to change player to game object other, but we also have to change the code that's in them. And we've got sort of 3 different groups of these in terms of what's in them.
Yep.
We've got a couple that have only got the 1 line of code in at the moment, and we've got some that have got more.
Yep, and as we all should know by now, static languages are better than dynamic languages. Sorry, that was my troll bait for the day. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and update the signature of the collide method on all of our objects. But notice how updating becomes an issue. I'm actually going to rename this to other. And the reason I'm renaming that to other is so that my parameter doesn't conflict with the game object property that's on all mono behaviors. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var player equals other get component player. If player is null, return. Again, my ReSharper formatting settings decided to become stupid.
Do you just want to thumbnail out, I think we've probably been over it before, but just exactly why that happens in that order?
Well, yeah, I mean, what we need to do is because these methods previously only worked with players, we now need to make them work with any kind of game object. So we need to query the game object that was collided with. We need to ask, are you a player? And if you are, give me your player aspect. Otherwise, I don't know what to do. I obviously can't work on a null reference, so I'm just going to abort and not deal with this collision method whatsoever, which is again codified on line 10 when we just throw our hands up in the air and say, go away, and return out of the method when the player is null. And again, if the player is null, that means what we collided with was not a player. Which is nice because this gives us a nice bit of reusable code that we can apply to each one of the methods that previously only worked with players. So if I jump into gate, I can simply say change this and then paste a curly, I guess. I didn't mean to paste a curly. Why did it paste a curly? There we go. And then so for goal, I simply change collide to game object other, and I paste that. Turret collider, same change. Game object other, paste in that code. Turret projectile, same thing. Game object other, bring in that code. Finish line, again, game object other, and bring in that code. Okay, is anybody confused about the changes that I've made? I'll deal with that one last error later. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit reset, and I'm going to actually pause. And we're back. So, if we jump back into player, you'll notice an error right here on line 35. Now, if you open up the quick fix on ReSharper, it's obviously not going to be, well, what we want, because it's suggesting to undo the change we did, create an overload for collide, or replace with new game object this. What we want to do here is pass in game object. That's because we are no longer passing in the player component. Keep in mind that a player is a mono behavior and a mono behavior is a component. We're no longer passing in the player component into the collide method. We are now passing in the game object that the player component is attached to. And we access that through the game object property.
And in actual fact, you could just as easily use this dot game object if you want to see the.
Yeah, if you wanted to do it the annoying way, you could do this dot game object.
Yeah.
And that accomplishes.
Because we've gone from just passing this to the game object that is its thing. But yeah, no, get rid of that. I hate it as well. I just thought it would be worth pointing out.
Still getting duplicate first level. When I die, the first instantiation not being destroyed. Check your finish line. Make sure that you have line 20.
Well, and also when you die, it shouldn't be getting destroyed or instantiated. It should be getting. It should just the position of it should be getting set back to 0 when you die. When you win, you cross the finish line. That's when your level changes.
Oh, right. Yeah, so when you die, if you look at the gate, or sorry, the player, that bit just resets the transform in the level. It doesn't actually reinstantiate the level. It's still getting instantiated again. Well, it shouldn't be, because the only time it gets instantiated should be within the playing game state's constructor. Is this the only time you instantiate the level? Alright, so then while you answer that, Eric, hopefully the change we made makes sense. Is there a resharper key that will rewrite the method signatures when you change an interface? I got asked in BuzzNet, and I'm not sure, and I'm sure it got missed. There is actually. It pops up on occasion. Resharper sometimes decides to show it, and sometimes doesn't. But it's a quick fix called method signature refactoring. But I'm not going to get into that because it's a resharper feature. But yes, the answer is yes. Can I play your CSC again? Yes.
Wow.
Huh?
He asked it correct in perfectly good English, and you utterly got the words in the wrong order. That was impressive.
Can I see player CS again?
Yeah, you said, "Can I play a CSC again?"
Oh.
Anywho.
It's probably the CS that got me. Line 46, can we take out? No. Well, I mean, good. It just wouldn't behave right.
It would blow up, won't it?
No.
Would it blow up? Because that's null.
It won't blow up. All it'll do is it will make it so that if you die when you're at, like, let's say the top left of the screen, then you'll reappear at the top left of the screen as opposed to reappearing at the center.
Yeah. It's like 2 weeks since I looked at that line of code.
Wolf, make sure that scroll level is being invoked in update. If it's grayed out, it's probably not being invoked. Loose screen state goes to start screen state, which in turn calls player screen state. Is that not correct? That is correct.
Yeah, I mean, the actual win and start and lose screens, you'd probably want an extra screen in there called something like level up, which would, give you, loading, level, whatever. And then I may well fit that in with the GUI stuff next week if there's time. Which there should be.
No.
It's not a difficult thing to fit in, but it does involve slightly more dealing with GUI and fonts and things. So
if you lose, actually, I think he's right. Now that I think about it, I don't think the yeah, he's right. We were wrong.
what do you mean we?
Okay, so in that case, we're going to jump into the lose screen state, and when the game is lost, we're going to destroy the current level. So in the constructor of lose screen state, I'm going to say object dot destroy manager current level, and then I'm going to say manager current level equals null. So, Stephen, this will fix your problems. And I suggest that everybody writes this code out. So on the lose screen states constructor, we will destroy the entire prefab and then assign the current level to null.
When you lose.
Yeah.
Properly lose. Sorry, misunderstood.
Okay. So is everybody good on stuff so far? Does anybody need 1 more minute? Hit 1 more minute if you guys need it. Otherwise, we will continue. Because we are reaching about the 2-hour mark very shortly here.
Justin wants to see finish line again.
Hmm?
Can you show finish line again?
Yeah.
This is one of those things where it's bitty. There's no getting around the fact that it's bitty due to the way we set everything up as individual scripts.
Right.
This goes back to the conversation I was having earlier with about nitpicking. There are a lot of nits.
To pick.
Indeed. You need a fine tooth comb.
Alrighty, so when you lose life, you get restarted from the beginning. Yes, that's how it should work.
Because the only other, or the better option really in terms of gameplay would be to sort of work out a safe place to restart somewhere during the, preceding moments to when you blew up. It's going to give the player time to be in a position where they've got space to, and there's no way of working that out programmatically. You'd have to actually deal with it in terms of setting up zones of, respawn points, and it's not so much more complicated. It's just more of the same sort of things that we've been doing in terms of setting up everything, all the other sort of colliders, and we just don't have the time to get into it if we're going to get through all the different aspects that are necessary in terms of making a basic game start to finish. I thought that was quite convincing.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Let's make the player shoot stuff. So
Engage. Are you using object.destroy? Because lose screen state isn't a mono behavior, you can't just use destroy on its own.
alrighty, so I'm going to add a new script. The new script I'm adding is going to be called player barrel. Player barrel is going to inherit from a mono behavior. Now, the code that's going into the player barrel should be fairly straightforward. It'll be very similar to the other barrel type. We'll have a projectile public game object field, as well as a public float attack delay, which we'll set to 0.25 by default. Then I'm going to say public float attack timer, which should become more important, or private float, sorry, whose use should become very apparent in the near future. On start, we're going to set attack timer to 0. On update, we're going to have a very simple method that's going to defer to two other methods. I'm going to say if can fire, then fire.
Those of you paying attention will notice that this is virtually line for line what goes on in the turret barrel so far. And actually for the most part.
Yep. Can fire will simply return input.getKey down key code space. And I'm not going to do get key down actually. I'm going to say get key code space, and we'll see why in a moment. And then I'll do attack timer smaller or equal to 0f. The private.
It's funny.
You what?
But you're using attack delay as an attack delay, and I was about to bring up the fact that I'd actually repurposed it and I'd just not renamed it for the sake of not confusing things. I was going to call it rate of fire, and it was basically there to stop people spamming the spacebar.
Right.
The idea being that rather than firing at a particular rate, you could fire up to a certain rate depending on how quickly you hit the spacebar.
Alrighty. So I'm going to actually pause the video for this one because it's a little bit of code to write out, but it should be fairly straightforward. On video, we'll go quickly through what it's supposed to do. We have a player barrel class that's very similar to our turret barrel class. It gets a projectile set on it as well as an attack delay, and it also keeps track of a timer. When our player barrel starts, we set our timer to 0, and then every time a frame happens that we have to update the component, we check to see if we need to fire. And if we do need to fire, we fire. So it's very straightforward code. Otherwise, we take the attack timer and we subtract time.delta time from it. The can fire method simply checks to see if spacebar is pressed down and that the attack time is going to allow us to actually fire, based off of like what Gavin just mentioned about people not being able to spam the spacebar key. The fire method itself is, again, straightforward. We reset our timer, we instantiate our projectile prefab, and we just set it to its current, our current position, rotation, and scale, and let it go forward. So I'm going to go ahead and pause. And we're back. So there's two more classes we're going to have to go ahead and implement. I want to go ahead and build a player projectile. Now, player projectile will be an interesting mono behavior. This is going to be the prefab that we hook up into our player. And again, it's going to implement mono or inherit from mono behavior. It's going to have a public game object explosion, which we'll talk about in a moment here. It'll have a public float speed defaulted to 0.5f. And it'll have a public float life expectancy of 2f. Then I'm going to create a private vector 3 velocity. And when I said private, I actually did mean private, not public. Now, on my public void start method, I'm simply going to say velocity equals vector 3 up times speed. I'll talk about that in a moment. Update will simply decrement the life expectancy by time.delta time, and then check to see if the life expectancy is smaller or equal to 0. And if it is, we will destroy ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to say transform translate, and we're going to pass in velocity and then space.self. This should be familiar to anybody who wrote our other projectile mono behavior. Then I'm going to write a method called onTriggerEnter that takes in a collider collided with. Now, see, in this case, because we have another thing that's moving. See, previously the only thing that really moved in our scene was our player, and our player handled being collided with other things, but now we have a situation where the player is not in control of the collision. Instead, it's going to be the player projectile. So the onTriggerEnter method is basically going to be more or less a carbon copy of what's in the player, and it'll translate the ugly, horrible, magic method awfulness of the onTriggerEnter method into a nice sort of standardized interface-based solution. So I'm going to go ahead and implement this, and it should be familiar to most everybody here. I'm going to say if the game object is not active, return. Then I'm going to do something interesting. I'm going to say if collided with get component player does not equal null, or collided with get component player barrel does not equal null, or collided with get component goal does not equal null. then simply return.
You can think of this like our ignore list.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope that the majority of this code doesn't need any explanation. Keep in mind that I did bring in a variety of using statements, such as link, assets code abstract, and Unity engine. So I did bring in these using statements. And it basically performs what the player already performed in the past. So, what we're going to go ahead and do now is write out our turret collider implementation, because our turret collider is now going to become an iGame entity, and it's actually going to, well, it already is, but it's going to handle two cases. It's going to handle if we collided with the player or if we collided with the projectile. If the turret collider gets hit by a projectile, what we need to do is destroy the turret. But there's something very important to keep in mind about the way we've kind of constructed our turret prefabs, and that is that our turrets, let's say I jump over into our scratch scene for a second and bring out a level 1, which I already do. Remember that our turrets are not the things that actually get collided with. The turret colliders are on like the riser and the rotator and the frame. They're not on the actual turret object itself. So we need a way to actually find, given any of the children of turret, we need to be able to find the parent of the turret, which is really easy to do with a very, very simple recursive method. And that's going to be private turret get turret game object parent, and is simply going to say var component equals parent get component turret. If component is not equal to null, then return component. Otherwise, again, I really need to fix these formatting settings. They're really irritating. Otherwise, if parent.transform.parent is not equal to null, then recurse. Then invoke get turret, passing in parent transform parent game object. Otherwise, throw a new invalid operation exception. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I'm going to invert this if statement. I'm going to say if player does not equal null. Then I'm going to say return at the end of this. Then I'm going to say var projectile equals other get component player projectile. So if the player projectile hits the turret, then simply destroy the turret. So say destroy, and then pass in get turret, passing in our current game object as the parent, and then grabbing the game object property from the turret that we grabbed. Now keep in mind that this .game object is very, very important, because the destroy method would quite happily allow us to omit this. However, if we say destroy get turret, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be destroying the mono behavior that is attached to the turret. We're not going to actually be destroying the entirety of the turret. We're simply going to be destroying the component. So we need to add the .game object to say, or to tell the destroy method that we actually want to destroy the entirety of the turret, all of its children, and all of its components. Okay.
It would probably be worth running just line by line through the code that you just added, the two methods to get turret and also the what you added to the player projectile.
Right, well the player projectile again is basically a carbon copy of the player, with the added bits of the projectile-ness. So for example, the update method decrements our life expectancy, or not decrements it, but subtracts from it based off of our time.delta time, and then appropriately makes the transform, makes the turret fly, or the projectile fly forward. However, when it runs into something, so this on-trigger enter method is the magical Unity method that is not in any way tied to any implementation or inheritance, and you have to make sure your spelling is right because you're not going to get a warning otherwise. Things are just not going to work. The on-trigger enter method is when Unity informs us that our projectiles hit something else. The first thing we do, well, we first make sure that the current projectile is active. The next thing we do is we say, okay, if we collided with a player barrel, or a goal, then simply return, because we don't care if we ran into a player barrel, or a goal. It doesn't matter much to us. Then we grab all of the mono behaviors on the thing that we collided with that implement iGameEntity, and we invoke their collide method. Finally, after we do that, we destroy the projectile and instantiate an explosion. The turret collider is simply a class that implements iGameEntity, and it can collide with two things. If the turret collider collides with the player, it destroys the player. If a turret collider collides with the player projectile, it destroys itself. Now the getTurret method, this recursive method, is simply a matter of recursing up the hierarchy to find a parent that has a component called turret on it. Now keep in mind that the way our hierarchy is organized, the collider scripts are not on the turret itself, they're on children of the turret. So we need to write a method that recursively goes up the hierarchy to identify which one of the game objects has the turret script attached to it. And we need to do that so that when we run into a player projectile, we can appropriately destroy the turret.
You could quite happily, if you wanted, stop that search with a different thing. So you could search for the turret riser, or whatever I call it, new riser, with just a few tweaks to the code. And then you would only destroy part of the object.
Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and see if people can get caught up with the code. This code will not work yet. We're very close to getting it to work, but I want people just to follow forward with this as much as they can. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter back. So let's go ahead and hook everything up. So you'll notice that we created the player projectile and the turret and modified other things, but we haven't actually hooked up any of the code that we're going to be using. So let's go ahead and do that really quickly. So for the player, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to add a barrel to the player. And
Unity's not on the screen at the moment.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump into our scene 1, and I'm going to jump on the player, and then I'm going to add a player barrel to it, which is just going to be an empty game object with the player barrel component added onto it. So I'm going to go up to game object and say create empty, and I'm going to call this player barrel. And I'm going to parent it to the player. Then I'm simply going to, well, I'll zero out its transform first, but...
And also, it's going to be in terms of code as is, to do it this way, you're going to need to rotate it so that Y is pointing forwards.
Right. So then I'm going to grab the rotation, and I'm going to push it forward by giving it an X of 90. Then I'm going to jump into my scripts, so code scripts, and I'm going to drag and drop barrel player, or player barrel, onto player barrel. Then I'm going to set its projectile prefab to a player barrel or to a projectile prefab, which I haven't even created yet. So I'm going to jump back into my scratch scene, and I'm going to create the prefab that is going to be the basis for all of the player's projectiles. So I'm going to jump into...
And this is just going to be a copy of the turret one.
Yeah.
But renamed.
It's pretty much. I mean, I'm just going to start off by dragging over a turret projectile, putting it at 0, 0, 0. And then I'm going to remove the turret projectile script from it. And I'm going to add on the player projectile script to it.
Don't forget to rename the actual...
Yeah. And then I'm going to rename it to player projectile. Then I'm going to simply detach it by going up to game object and say break prefab instance. And then I'm going to remake it into a prefab by clicking and dragging it into the prefabs folder. And now we have a player projectile prefab. So now if I jump back into our scene 1, I can now go into player and click on his player barrel, and I can set his projectile to our player projectile. And now when I run the code, I get some interesting behavior.
Did you put the actual player barrel onto the player barrel?
Yes. And I set it to the player projectile prefab, and the player projectile prefab still has a turret projectile attached to it. Okay, so I'm going to do this again. I'm going to say remove component. I'm going to click and drag and make sure that my player projectile script is attached to my player projectile. Then I'm going to hit apply. So now our player projectile script is attached to our player projectile prefab. Now, by jumping back into our scene 1 and hitting play, we now get the behavior we're looking for. And of course, we get some unassigned reference exceptions because we haven't actually set the explosion prefab to anything.
You're probably going to want to make those a lot smaller as well. Those projectiles, I believe, should have a scale. Well, actually, the player barrel should have a scale of 0.15.
Right, so I'm going to jump into the player barrel, and I'm going to give the player barrel scale of 0.15, 0.15, and 0.15.
0.15.
0.15. And then I'm going to hit play, and that looks a lot better. And now everything is actually working. If you'll notice very carefully, our player prefabs our projectile prefabs are actually being destroyed when they run into gates, but then they also destroy turrets when they run into turrets. So that's pretty much it, other than the explosion stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and reset everybody's ready and pause the video recording. So there actually ended up being a small bug with our update method of player projectile. Notice how right here on line 23 I'm saying destroy this. Because I'm in the context of a mono behavior, what that's going to do is it's going to destroy the mono behavior. It's not actually going to destroy the game object. So to fix it, I can simply say destroy game object. And now when I go back and run, now you'll notice that there is indeed a real life expectancy for our bullets. And they do get destroyed appropriately.
Cool.
And we're back. So let's go ahead and talk about explosions. What we need to do is we need to create an explosion prefab.
Are you waiting for me to speak? Some indication would have been good. Yeah, we need to make explosions. Now, this is an actual full-on discussion of the particle systems is out of place here. They're really quite deep a system. But they've also recently changed, or relatively recently changed over to the new system. So I'm going to show, as of the recording, we're on 3.5-ish version of Unity. And the first thing we're going to want to do, yes, this is 355F2. I'm using 355F5, I think, at the moment. It should all be the same, with only buggy or less buggy. But the first thing you're going to want to do is go down to the project and add. No, you don't. You want to right-click in the project window.
On which folder?
No, in the project window, or wherever you want to put it, and do import package. And where is it? Particles. And for the sake of ease, make sure everything's selected and import it. It will all come into the standard assets namespace and some odd textures. Now, I'm going to go about things two ways here. The first one is just a variation on one of the packed particle systems that we've just brought in. And the other is one we're going to start from scratch. If you could just give me a second while I get the correct Unity project open in front of me.
Pony, 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 pony,
You're just going to think pony thoughts.
No, well, I'm entertaining the crowd. Hopefully. Probably not,
That's
though.
the wrong one, isn't it? Open. No.
Where did standard assets come from? That was a right-click on my project window, and then I said import package, and then I brought in particles, and then standard assets appeared. So yeah, so how's the weather? Actually, how is the weather?
I don't know. Where are they?
70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's actually pretty awful. I hate it when it's that hot. It doesn't look like it's going to get any better this week. Ugh.
Okay. The first one we're going to do is going down to, where is it? Flame explosion, which is flame. Inside that fire folder, I believe, is a flame prefab. If you go into your other scene, your scratch scene, and then drag the flame into and zero its position out, please. And the first thing I want you to do is disconnect it from the prefab.
It would if all of a sudden everything didn't just go all crazy. Oh, there it did. Okay, so I'm going to click on the flame prefab, and I'm going to click on game object, and then break prefab instance.
Okay, now rename your flame to anything else. I've called it flame explosion.
Why are there two eyes in there?
Because you keep typing two eyes for some reason. Now, we've got an inner core, a light source, an outer core, and smoke. For now, just for the ease of use, I'm just going to delete the light source. In fact, if I've got mouse control, I probably could, but it's easier just to tell you. And now, this is the old-fashioned interface. If you click on inner, outer, or smoke, this is the old-fashioned interface for dealing with putting together particle systems. And you've got the emitter, you've got an animator, and these are components. I believe I imagine they're still available up via the component menu. Let me just check. Component, physics. No, not physics. Effects, particle systems, legacy particles. You get the particle emitters and particle animator. And so if you've got old, you know, if you find effects that have been put together on the web and stuff, a lot of them are going to be in this format rather than the other, so it's worth at least knowing what to look for. Both versions actually do all the same things, it's just the interface is laid out differently. The key things we need to do here, if you select the inner core first, and what we want to do, I'm just comparing settings. We need the min and max emission of 20. World velocity and local velocity should both be all noughts. Random velocities to 0.02.
On each component?
Across, yeah, all three of those. 0.02. That's as is. Tangent velocities are all 0. I think that's the default. That's the default, that's the default. You can scroll down. You need to check, and this is important, one shot.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Ellipsoid. Can you just open that up? If you select all of those to 0.4, so set Y to 0.4. Leave those the same. And check auto-destruct on the particle animator. Shadows. No, that's all fine. And everything else stays the same. And due to a limited amount of screen space I've actually got the questions panel and BuzzNet covered up at the moment. So if people are asking me things, I can't see them.
I don't see any questions for you.
Okay. So that was the inner core. We're going to do very similar things to the other two. So, in fact, do you want to... Which way do you want to do it? Do you want to let everyone get through the inner core and make sure they've all got that? Or do you want to do all three?
Well, because we're so strapped to time right now, I'm just going to go ahead and go through the settings.
Okay. To be perfectly honest, these settings are trial and error to make it look how you want it to look. I'm just going down these so that you end up with something roughly right. So next one is outer core. And for this one we need set min and max emission to 50. World, local, velocities both to zeros across the board. Random velocity of 0.2 across the board. They're all defaults. One shot needs checking. And ellipsoid needs setting to 0.65 across the board. And auto-destruct on particle animator. And I do believe that's it for that. I think.
Including smoke?
No, for the outer core. Smoke next. Same sort of thing. Min and max emissions I set to, for some reason I set them to 40 and 50, but I don't know why I did that. It should be 40 each, probably. Zero out world and local velocities. And the random values to 0.3. And this other thing, ellipsoid set to 0.75. And auto-destruct in the particle animator.
And then as well as one shot.
And one shot, yes. Sorry, I thought I'd said that. But that, I believe, should be our flame explosion prefab. It seems you've got something moving, which is odd.
Looks like the inner core is slightly moving, but it shouldn't be because I have only the random velocity set. It's probably just a matter of the fact that we're looking at it repeat over and over again.
It could well be. Yeah. But anyway, so if you now drag that flame explosion, also be aware that these are going to be difficult to read in the editor window if you've got the inspector and the project and hierarchy views all visible. That will affect your frame rate when you're dealing with particles. But yeah, if you drag that across into prefabs now.
Hold on, somebody say something about Y position should be 0. I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, it should. Oh yeah, it should there. The transform of the inner core should be set to 0. That is a good catch. That was me forgetting to tell you to do that. Yeah, 0 those out for each of those. Because this effect, as it out of the box, is designed for a campfire.
Yeah, and not for something that's in space.
Yeah, basically, all I've done is just make it into a ball instead of what it was. But yeah, now that was a good catch, whoever caught that. But if you drag the flame explosion into prefabs,
yep.
Voiler, there is our first explosion.
So now if I go and jump over to my other scene.
Well, do you want to shall I make the other explosion now as well?
I want to see this work real fast, basically.
Okay.
So I'm going to jump into actually, no. I'm going to jump back into Scratch. I'm going to delete the flame explosion out of my hierarchy. I'm going to bring over my player projectile. Then I'm going to set his explosion to my new...
You need to be in...
what did I call this thing? Flame explosion. So, then I just set my player projectile's explosion property to flame explosion. Now I hit apply. Now when I jump back into my scene 1 and hit play, notice how we get particle effects.
I think I missed a setting, you know. There's an inherent velocity setting on one or other of them, and I'm not sure whether it's on that one. Let me just double check. Flame explosion. I think it's on the other one. In fact, I know it's on the other one, but I thought it was on that one as well. Ignore me. So yeah.
So yep, we have explosions. So what's the next type of thing we are doing?
Well, I thought I'd just also run down how to do a new one from scratch, because, as I say, there is this new shuriken particle system, and it is quite a lovely way of accessing things. It also has things like a graph editor for opacity curves and all sorts of goodness like that, although it is a bit in terms of its curve handling, but still. Right, you're in the scratch scene, so if you create a particle effect, sorry, it will be a game object, I think. Yeah, there we go. Create of a particle system. Voiler. We now get this lovely
thing.
new shiny
Bubbles.
particle system.
Derpy hooves.
Yes, sort of spitting out sort of default things.
Anybody who's a brony will get the reference to derpy hooves.
Now, there are a few things we need to change. Have I just created that from scratch? Yes, because I'm an idiot. I just created a new one because I was telling you how to do it. That's the one I need to see. Right. We need to do the following. Set the duration to 1. Uncheck looping. Start lifetime is 1. Now, start speed, if you click on that little arrow to the right, you'll get a drop-down list. And we need this to be random between 2 constants. It just gives us our random range, and that's 0.5 and 2. Start size, similarly, needs to be set to a random range of 0.8 and 1.2. And similarly, start rotation, 0 to 360. Otherwise, all our flames would be the same way around.
Yeah.
Which
It doesn't work in space.
Start color, you can... hang on. Let me just double check my colors. Yeah, set start color to black. I think. Yes. If it all looks weird at the end, it's because that should need to go back to white. So remember that. Gravity modifier is 0. Inherit velocity. Now this is what I thought I was looking for on the other one. Set that to 1. Because I remember our scene is kind of moving and things are moving and it looks better, basically. So that will inherit the velocity, or 1 times the velocity of whatever triggers it. Simulation space I've set to world. It doesn't really matter. One thing you will want to do is zero out your transforms, position, rotation and scale. Position and rotation. Sorry, I just noticed that. Where do we get to? Simulation space, world. Play on awake is checked, and max particles 1000. Now, if you open up your emission and set the rate to, I've set mine to 4000, that might be a little bit on the high side. This is in particles per second. So because we've set max particles to 1000, we're only going to get 1000 particles, and they will take 1/4 of a second to be emitted. That's right. Great, that's fine. We're not going to worry about bursts. You can play around with that as well. That would let you do sort of secondary puffs of things and all sorts of goodness. But that's it for emission. Shape is the next one. Shape needs to be set to sphere. Radius 0.2. And random direction checked. Now the next one down is going to be color over lifetime. Now, it's an interesting thing with the way they set it up. It's about the 4th one down from where you were. Before you can, if you just uncheck that main checkbox on it again, so open it up, you can't actually do anything with the color. You can. It looks like you can, but you can't. So if you ever click on it and going, why won't it let me do? Something should be happening. You need to click that checkbox to activate it. That subsection. So if you go ahead now and click cover over lifetimes checkbox, and magic will occur, it will come to life. Now, I just put together a gradient if you, again, to the right of the colour swatch there, click on the little triangle thing, it's set to gradient. That's where we want it set, but I just wanted to point that out. If you click on the swatch, you'll get a Photoshop style window to input colours. And you've got a maximum of 8, what are they called?
Stop points.
Stop points for colour, and that's the bottom row. And you've got a maximum of 8 for opacity, which is the top row. And you create new ones simply by, I think it's, which did you do, right or left click?
Left click, it's just like Photoshop.
Left click. I can't try it out on mine because I've filled it up. But yeah, it's the same principle as Photoshop. And I've put together, I gave it a dark brown, followed by an orange, a yellow. Quite a dark.
People can play around with this.
Yeah, this is very much the taste. Followed by a white, followed by an orange. And the dark brown that I used was actually a dark red. It just looked brown, but yeah. And then an orange, another one of the first colour, and then a black.
So another one of the.
Basically, it starts dark and ends dark. If you've got mine open there, presumably as well.
I mean, that looks good, right?
Yeah. And then you could just tail the opacity off in the last 10. So if you move that dark swatch away from the end, and then move that one there to the right. Yeah. And then no, on the end one. No, move that to the right, but then on the end one, change its opacity to 0. What you're doing is making sure that it gets to black while it's still visible and then fades out. Yeah, that sort of thing. And again, this is very much, these values are,
what looks good.
Season to taste, whatever you think makes a nice looking explosion. Can I close that out? The only other thing we need to go into is the renderer, which is right down the bottom of the list. And where it says default particle, click on Nelson's very favourite button under the material for the renderer.
Oh my stupid little circly.
Yes. And now you've got all of these lovely textures, materials that you can choose from. And the one that we're looking for is just called smoke. Just called smoke. Second row down, third from the right.
Right, so this one right here?
Yeah. And cast and receive shadows need to be turned off. Smoke, billboard, none, 0, max particles. Shader particles alpha blended, that is correct.
Nope.
What did you just change?
Set start color to white.
Haha! So, yes, good job, I knew that was wrong. See what I mean? That's interesting. So start color must act not so much as a start color, but as a color.
Something like some sort of multiplier.
That's what confused me, was the fact that it's called start color, and I had left it as white originally in mine, hence mine working, and then but obviously from the colors they start dark, so I thought I should be starting with a dark color, but clearly not. So there we are. Yes. For anyone who missed that, the start colour that we changed earlier to black should be white. I hope you can see that we've got a lot, basically all the same settings we're accessing. And in code terms, we really are accessing, I would imagine, the very same things, except for certain properties that are absent on the older thing.
Yeah.
But, yeah, like I say, there is more to look at. You will notice also that there are graph windows that you can open up for things like the opacity over time. I had oh my.
That was horrible. I very much apologize to everybody who had to hear that.
Thank you. If you look in, for example, size over lifetime is probably anything of these that change over time or change over something. You can actually open up a curve editor. If you go up to the top, you'll need to scroll up and click on Open Editor. You've got all of those settings that were in the inspector down the left-hand side, but you've also got a curve editor. So here you can do things like change the size, add keys. It's not the nicest implementation of curves, but it's, at least it's there, and you can get some good effects. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface of what it can do. But other than that, oh right, okay, I suppose you ought to actually stop playing around with the particle system and actually finish it off. So, if your newly created particle system, if you rename that in the hierarchy to, I called mine Explosion FX. Wow.
I really want two eyes in that word. I don't know why.
Yeah, you do. And then create that as a prefab.
Yep, and then if I jump over to the other scene, I can now set... Actually, no. I have to jump back into Scratch. Then if I bring my player projectile prefab up back into the inspector, now I can change his explosion over to Explosion FX. Then I hit apply. Now I jump over to my other scene, and we'll now have the new awesome explosion that we created.
Now, have you got the explosion that happens when you die?
No.
Did you put that in?
Nope. But I think that's going to have to wait till next week.
Well, that was really all I wanted to go through. Like I say, it wasn't enough. There are... Oh, I know what I was going to say, which is that in the Fundamentals series, Zach obviously goes over the particle system, the old one, and in the simple game that Buzz did a while back, they go through creating a very similar explosion to this one, but with the old particle system as well. So there is plenty more particle-related stuff, even just on 3D Buzz.
Yep.
But really the best way to get to grips with particle systems is to try and make one. Yeah, it literally is just to play with them. There's also all that stuff about waterfalls in the third-person game, or the simple level, all over the place. There's lots of stuff about that.
Yep. Okay, so for homework, I want people to re-implement everything that we saw in the video, which is kind of an implicit homework instruction. But I also want to see people create up to 3 levels with turrets and gates and fun stuff like that. How do you feel about that, Gavin?
Yeah, that works for me.
Sweet.
Because next week we're going to get into, basically we just need to tidy up, reporting information to the player, a discussion of on GUI and related stuff, and Engage just said, I'll do mine as DLC. Don't get me started. So there's that, and then we'll tie the lives and score into the GUI system. And, oh, really, you've got a game, and you've got the ability to make as many levels of whatever difficulty you'd like.
Yeah, it's
Honestly, it feels like there ought to be something else to cover in it, but really,
yeah, and yeah, you have a game, and most importantly, though, I hope that people what they get away from this is how to use the Unity editor to construct interesting levels. I mean, it is very flexible once you start getting in the mindset of scripting, and from the very beginning, this entire class was mainly how does Unity work? How do you script things for it? Because anybody can go to the asset store and pick up a bunch of pre-created assets and pre-created scripts, and then they end up with a game that barely works. The idea about this course was to talk about, well, how do we interact with the Unity editor with kind of a focus on scripting?
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Unity, I think I've said this before in the breaks, but I personally find it easier to order my thoughts in this by writing things in code as much as possible. The creation of game objects and the creation of components, I like to do all in code. It just helps me think things through, what's happening when and where and in what order. And Unity gives you the option of doing either, really. I don't know really where I'm going with that. I just thought I'd mention it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that to all the future people, we will see you next week. I'm going to go ahead and hang up the recording. Hopefully everybody who's watching this video in the future will be able to, follow along, get all the settings that we had done, pause the video and all that fun stuff. But we'll be sticking around a little bit longer for those people who are in the class, and to future people who are interested in having live interactive help. Don't be afraid of actually attending the classes live. So,
Be afraid. Very afraid.
So, I mean, we'll see you all later. This is all we wanted to cover, and we'll be sticking around to help people out. So, goodbye.
Goodbye.
And that's it. Pony.